At 4 a.m., streets that normally carried the low hum of delivery trucks and early commuters fell into an unnatural silence. In Chicago, wind cut through empty rail yards and echoed between warehouses as unmarked vans rolled to a stop. Doors opened in sequence. Boots hit pavement. Radios clicked once, then went quiet. This was not a routine arrest sweep. It was coordination on a national scale, unfolding at the exact same moment in more than 20 metropolitan areas. From the ports of Long Beach to the industrial corridors of the Midwest and the suburbs of the Northeast, thousands of federal agents surged forward under a single operational directive. Units from the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Immigration and Customs Enforcement and Drug Enforcement Administration moved with military precision breaching sites that had long operated in plain sight. The code name was stark and deliberate: the Surge. Its target was not a street gang or a neighborhood crew. It was a transnational system embedded inside the American economy. Chicago stood at the center of that system. For years, intelligence assessments had quietly labeled the city as a critical artery where narcotics arriving from the Southwest were consolidated, repackaged, and redirected toward the East Coast. Freight hubs doubled as chemical depots. Legitimate trucking firms masked illicit supply chains. The city's strategic location made it indispensable to networks that treated American infrastructure as their own. What changed was not the cartel's presence, but Washington's posture. Under President Donald Trump's administration in 2025, the rules of engagement shifted. The mandate was no longer containment, it was disruption. Federal planners concluded that piecemeal arrest had failed, allowing leadership and logistics to regenerate. This time, the objective was to decapitate the system in one synchronized blow. As breach charges tore through steel doors in Chicago's industrial district, agents encountered something far beyond hidden packages or improvised labs. Inside were production schedules, coded ledgers, and logistics maps that mirrored corporate planning documents. The scale confirmed what analysts had warned for years. These organizations no longer behaved like criminal gangs. They functioned like multinational enterprises. Across the country, similar scenes unfolded. In New England, nearly 200 arrests were logged in parallel operations linked to the same network. On the West Coast, port facilities were sealed before dawn, intercepting shipments flagged months earlier by financial intelligence units. The timing was deliberate. By striking everywhere at once, federal authorities denied the cartels their greatest advantage: speed and adaptation. But the most unsettling revelation came early in the operation. Some of the individuals targeted were not hiding in safe houses or warehouses. They worked inside institutions meant to stop trafficking. Investigators had concluded that cartel influence was not pressing at the border alone. It was embedded deep within domestic systems, exploiting trust access and authority. As the sun rose over Chicago, flashing lights reflected off empty streets. Thousands were already in custody nationwide. Evidence trucks rolled out under armed escort, and within federal command centers, a realization settled in: this was not simply a law enforcement action. It was the opening move in a campaign redefining how America confronts internal threats tied to global criminal power. The surge had begun, and with it a question that would echo far beyond that morning: had the country waited too long to recognize what it was really fighting? What investigators uncovered next shattered any remaining illusion that this was a conventional crime story. Inside seized servers and encrypted communications was a blueprint that looked disturbingly familiar to anyone who had studied global corporations. The Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel were no longer operating as loose criminal alliances. They had become vertically integrated enterprises with defined management layers, performance metrics, and contingency planning that rivaled multinational firms. Intelligence analysts described the structure bluntly: executive leadership in Mexico, regional directors in U.S. cities, logistics managers embedded in freight and warehousing, financial officers overseeing laundering pipelines, and enforcement units acting as private security. Chicago functioned as a continental headquarters. It was where bulk shipments were broken down, rerouted, and tracked with precision that mirrored legitimate supply chain software. Documents seized during the raids showed shipment timetables synchronized with rail traffic, highway congestion data, and even weather forecasts. Delays were costed, losses were amortized, replacement routes were pre-approved. This was not improvisation, it was planning at scale. The transformation did not happen overnight. Over the past decade, pressure from law enforcement had forced cartels to evolve. Open violence drew attention. Visibility invited disruption. The response was corporate camouflage. Shell companies purchased warehouses. Legitimate trucking fleets were absorbed or coerced. Employees often had no idea their payrolls were being subsidized by narcotics revenue. The cartels hid behind balance sheets instead of gunmen. This model also insulated leadership. When a street-level dealer was arrested, operations continued without interruption. When a local cell collapsed, another filled the gap within weeks. The system was designed to absorb losses just as multinational firms hedge against regional instability. Federal analysts concluded that previous enforcement strategies had been fighting symptoms, not structure. What made the surge different was its focus on middle management. Thousands of arrests targeted chemists, accountants, dispatch coordinators, and regional supervisors, the connective tissue that kept the machine running. Removing them all at once created systemic shock. For the first time, distribution networks went dark simultaneously across multiple states. But the most chilling insight came from intelligence linking these operations to global supply chains. Chemical precursors originated in Asia, moving through legitimate export channels before reaching clandestine labs in Mexico. Finished product traveled north through corridors masked by migrant flows and overwhelmed border infrastructure. Every stage exploited openness of markets, borders, and institutions. Officials began using language once reserved for hostile states. Briefings described the fentanyl crisis not as collateral damage, but as deliberate destabilization. Synthetic opioids were cheap, compact, and lethal at scale. They hollowed out communities, strained healthcare systems, and eroded public trust. From a strategic lens, the impact mirrored asymmetric warfare. As dawn turned to morning on the first day of the surge, federal command centers watched real-time maps flicker with seized nodes. Entire regions went silent. Distribution channels that once pulsed like arteries flatlined within hours. The cartels had built something vast and resilient, but even corporate empires collapse when their core is exposed. And yet, amid the apparent victory, another question surfaced. If these organizations had grown this powerful without being stopped, what else had been missed and who had allowed it to happen? The scale of the fentanyl seizure forced a recalibration of reality. Inside a warehouse near Chicago's rail corridors, agents stepped into what looked less like a stash site and more like a factory floor. Pallets were stacked with uniform precision. Containers were labeled with falsified industrial codes. Behind false walls wrapped in layers of plastic and chemical masking agents sat the core evidence of the operation's true purpose: 818 pounds of fentanyl. For seasoned agents, the number was almost abstract. 2 milligrams can be fatal. What lay in that warehouse represented potential lethal doses measured not in thousands or millions, but in multiples of the entire US population. Analysts later described it as an industrial kill capacity, synthetic, scalable, and devastatingly efficient. This was not accidental overflow. Seized production logs revealed output targets calibrated to demand spikes following law enforcement disruptions elsewhere. When one city tightened enforcement, shipments surged to another. The system behaved like a market responding instantly to pressure and opportunity. Addiction was not a byproduct, it was the business model. Federal chemists traced the drug's origin backward through a chain that spanned continents. Precursors sourced from overseas chemical suppliers moved through legitimate trade channels, blending into the vast volume of global commerce. By the time they reached clandestine laboratories, the paper trail had dissolved. What emerged was a final product engineered for potency, profit, and concealment. Public health officials briefed on the findings used stark language. Fentanyl was described as a mass casualty substance operating below the threshold of war. It killed quietly, one overdose at a time, hollowing out families and communities without triggering the alarms reserved for conventional threats. Emergency rooms became front lines. First responders carried naloxone like battlefield medics carry tourniquets. The surge exposed how deeply this chemical weapon had penetrated everyday life. Distribution hubs were not hidden in remote deserts. They sat beside commuter rail lines and grocery distribution centers. Trucks carrying fentanyl shared highways with school buses and delivery vans. The infrastructure of normalcy had been weaponized. Investigators also found evidence of quality control. Batches were tested, potency adjusted, and mixtures modified to maximize addictiveness while minimizing detection. Failures were logged. Losses were written off. This was not reckless poisoning, it was calculated harm. As word of the seizure spread, officials faced a sobering reality. Destroying one stockpile, even one of historic size, did not end the crisis. It revealed its depth. The capacity to produce more remained, unless the entire chain from chemicals to cash was dismantled. In briefings to lawmakers, intelligence officers framed the moment as a crossroads. The United States could continue treating fentanyl as a criminal epidemic responding after damage was done, or it could confront it as a strategic threat demanding tools, coordination, and urgency normally reserved for national defense. Standing inside that Chicago warehouse amid forklifts and evidence markers, the question was no longer whether fentanyl was killing America. The question was whether America was prepared to fight something designed to blend invisibly into its own systems, and whether this operation was the beginning of that answer. Follow the money, and the scope of the operation expanded even further. As agents cataloged evidence from Chicago to the coasts, financial intelligence teams began mapping what the cartels had built behind the drugs. What emerged was a parallel economy. More than $200 million in assets were seized in the opening phase alone. Vacuum-sealed cash, cryptocurrency, hardware wallets, luxury vehicles, and gold bars hidden behind the front of legitimate commerce. This was not profit waiting to be spent. It was working capital. Investigators traced laundering routes through shell companies embedded in real estate, nightlife, construction, and logistics. Chicago profits flowed into property acquisitions in Miami, freight contracts in Texas, and digital wallets routed through offshore exchanges. Every layer was designed to fragment responsibility and obscure ownership. Money moved faster than warrants. By the time one account was frozen, another was already active. But cash was only half the story. Parallel to the northbound drug flows was a southbound river of weapons. Interdictions linked to the surge intercepted convoys carrying military-grade firearms concealed beneath produce and consumer goods. AR-style rifles, .50 caliber platforms, and conversion kits were bound for cartel enforcement units, private armies tasked with protecting labs' routes and leadership. This two-way supply chain exposed a brutal symmetry. Poison moved north, firepower moved south. Both relied on American infrastructure. Highways, ports, and financial systems were exploited as neutral terrain tools turned against the society that built them. Federal briefings emphasized that this was no longer a border-only phenomenon. Seizures tied to the operation spanned multiple states, simultaneously underscoring how deeply embedded the networks had become. Analysts described the cartels as operating a continent-wide logistics web one that adapted faster than fragmented enforcement could respond. The designation of major cartels as terrorist organizations under President Donald Trump's administration changed that calculus. It unlocked authorities normally reserved for national security threats, enabling coordination across agencies that once operated in parallel lanes. Financial surveillance intensified, intelligence sharing accelerated, the objective shifted from arrest counts to systemic collapse. Yet even as assets were seized and routes disrupted, officials acknowledged a hard truth. Markets abhor vacuums. If pressure eased, replacement networks would emerge. The success of the surge depended not just on force, but on sustained disruption, closing loopholes in finance, trade, and oversight that had enabled the cartel's rise. In internal assessments, strategists framed the moment as a stress test for American resilience. Could open systems remain open without being exploited? Could economic freedom coexist with security in an era of transnational criminal power? As evidence trucks rolled out and financial accounts were frozen, the answer remained uncertain. The money had been hit, the weapons flow exposed, but the real battle lay ahead, preventing a rebuilt network from rising in the shadows left behind. The most unsettling discovery of the surge was not hidden in warehouses or ledgers. It was wearing uniforms. As thousands of suspects moved through federal processing centers, investigators began cross-referencing names, faces, and access histories. Patterns emerged that transformed a criminal case into a national reckoning. Some of those arrested were not smugglers or chemists. They were sworn officials, county sheriffs, border inspectors, and federal officers entrusted with enforcing the law. Internal files revealed how corruption had metastasized quietly. Bribes were not always crude cash drops. They came as consulting fees, real estate deals, debt relief, and cryptocurrency transfers routed through shell entities. In return, sensitive databases were accessed, inspections were delayed, and certain vehicles were waved through without scrutiny. The badge had become camouflage. One case file described a customs officer who used federal authority to redirect inspection resources away from specific lanes, creating predictable gaps exploited by traffickers. Another detailed supervisors who buried cases tied to donors linked to cartel-controlled businesses. These were not isolated lapses, they were nodes in a compromised system. For agents on the ground, this realization cut deeper than any seizure tally. The cartels had not simply evaded enforcement, they had penetrated it. The threat was no longer framed as external pressure at the border, but as an internal security breach undermining institutional trust. Federal leadership responded with language rarely used in domestic crime briefings. Betrayal, infiltration, insider threat. The surge was reframed as a purge, removing compromised elements to restore credibility. Integrity units worked alongside tactical teams, ensuring that arrests did not tip off targets inside the system. The human cost of corruption was impossible to ignore. Every bribe taken translated into drugs reaching neighborhoods. Every case buried meant another family devastated by overdose. Officials emphasized that corruption was not a victimless crime, it was an accelerant. Yet amid the damage, the operation revealed resilience. For every official exposed, dozens of agents had resisted pressure, reported irregularities, and worked in silence for months. The surge succeeded because those individuals refused to look away, even when doing so meant turning on colleagues. As court proceedings began, public trust hung in the balance. Accountability would determine whether institutions could recover or fracture further. The question facing the country was stark. Could a democracy confront corruption within its own guardians and emerge stronger? The answer would define not just the outcome of this operation, but the future credibility of American justice itself. By the time the surge entered its final phase, the language around it had fully changed. What began as a coordinated law enforcement operation was now openly framed as a national security response. Under President Donald Trump's administration, the formal designation of major cartels as terrorist threats redefined the battlefield. The objective was no longer disruption alone, it was deterrence, accountability, and long-term denial of operational space. This shift carried consequences. Agencies that once operated within narrow legal lanes now coordinated under a unified strategic umbrella. Intelligence sharing accelerated across federal, state, and military channels. Financial surveillance expanded. Cartel leadership was no longer treated as elusive criminals, but as hostile actors whose networks threatened domestic stability. Yet the surge also exposed a deeper tension. America's strength has always rested on openness, free markets, mobility, and trust in institutions. Those same qualities had been exploited. The question confronting policymakers was not whether force could dismantle networks, but whether the system itself could adapt without sacrificing its core values. Communities scarred by fentanyl watched closely. For families who had lost children, the operation felt overdue. For civil liberties advocates, the expanded authorities raised concerns about precedent and oversight. The balance between security and freedom, long debated in foreign conflicts, was now a domestic dilemma. Inside federal assessments, one conclusion stood out. The surge worked because it treated the threat holistically: drugs, money, weapons, and corruption as one ecosystem. Fragmented responses had failed. Integrated pressure had produced results. Thousands were arrested. Hundreds of millions in assets were seized. Entire logistics corridors went dark. But officials cautioned against declaring victory. The forces that fueled the crisis, globalized trade, chemical supply chains, and economic desperation had not vanished. Criminal power adapts. It waits for gaps. Sustained vigilance would determine whether this moment marked a turning point or a temporary disruption. As courtrooms filled and investigations widened, a final question emerged, one that reached beyond cartels and arrests. What does justice demand when those sworn to protect the public betray that trust? And how far should a democracy go to defend itself from enemies that thrive within its own systems? The answer will shape not only the next phase of this fight, but America's strategic identity in an era where the line between crime and war has all but disappeared. The surge marked one of the most consequential domestic security operations in modern American history. What unfolded before dawn across multiple cities exposed a reality long underestimated: transnational cartels had evolved into corporate-scale powers embedded within U.S. infrastructure. The seizure of 8,818 pounds of fentanyl revealed an industrialized kill chain designed for mass harm, while the confiscation of more than $200 million in assets mapped a parallel economy laundering poison into legitimacy. Even more alarming was the exposure of internal corruption. Officials entrusted with enforcing the law were found facilitating trafficking, transforming a criminal crisis into an insider threat. The response, reframing cartels as terrorist entities, signaled a strategic pivot under President Donald Trump's administration, unlocking tools once reserved for national defense. Yet the operation also illuminated a fragile balance. Security measures strengthened, but questions of oversight, civil liberties, and systemic vulnerability remain unresolved. The surge demonstrated that integrated pressure can disrupt even the most entrenched networks, but it also underscored that criminal power thrives on gaps in vigilance. Ultimately, the story is not just about drugs or arrests. It is about whether open societies can defend themselves without losing what makes them free, and whether accountability can restore trust where betrayal once flourished.